And we're live. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this wonderful Sunday afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Um, Today, we'll be discussing writing grief in science fiction and fantasy. I have a wonderful cast of panelists here with me today. I'm so excited to get into this topic. But before I kind of read everyone's bios and introduce everyone, I wanted to give a few shout outs. First of all, I want to shout out Erica of the Broken Spine, a fellow booktuber and book blogger, because uh, basically in talking to her, I kind of came up with the idea for this panel. It was inspired by reading And This Is How to Stay Alive by Shingai and Jerry Kagunda, who's on the panel today. And I was like, wow, like what a way to talk about grief in science fiction and fantasy. Like I'd love to talk about this more in depth, more authors, get everyone's feedback, and just get people's brain juices flowing. At least that's what I like. So shout out to Erica. I'd also like to shout out Susan Palumbo because when I was pulling together the panel, I was kind of like, honestly, I went to like find new people. I was like, I need help. And Susan recommended one of the panelists here today, Dominique. So thank you, Susan Palumbo. And yeah, so just a reminder to viewers at home, this is a live interview. So if you have questions, you can put them in the comments section. And if they seem relevant to the discussion, I'll ask them to the panelists. And if you just have nice things to say to the panelists, I will make sure that they see the nice things. So yeah, that's it for intros. Let's get into the panel. So I'm going to start just kind of like I had the bio set up, so it's just going to be kind of a random order. So I'm going to start with Shingai. Shingai and Jerry Kagunda is an Afro-surreal futurist storyteller from Nairobi, Kenya. Shingai's work has been featured in the Best American Sci-Fi and Fantasy 2020, Year's Best African Speculative Fiction 2021, and Year's Best Dark Fantasy and Horror 2020. She has work in or upcoming in Omenana, Fantasy Magazine, Fractured Lit, Choreo, Africa Risen, and Uncanny Magazine. Her debut novella, And This Is How to Stay Alive, was published by Neon Hemlock Press in October 2021. She is the co-editor of Podcastle Magazine and the co-founder of Voodoo Knots. Shingai is a creative writing teacher, an eternal student, and a lover of all things soft and black. And do you have any upcoming projects we should keep an eye out for, Shingai?
I do have a story coming out in Lightspeed soon, so that's one that I'm excited about. That'll be really fun. And I will be teaching a summer 1 day, 1 hour free class for Clarion West on what the future tells us about the past. Yeah. And keep your eyes on Voodoo Knots.
Okay. For those, sorry, I forgot to mention this to the viewers, but everyone's website links are in the description box, as well as the link for Voodoo Knots, and I will throw in the links for the Lightspeed magazine and the Clarion West panel as well. So next up, I introduce Zen E. Rocklin. Zen E. Rocklin is a contributor to Bram Stoker nominated and This Is Horror award winning Nox Paradolia, Kaiju Rising 2, Reign of Monsters. Sorry, I stole over that. Brigands, a Black Guards anthology, and Forever Vacancy anthologies, and Weird Luck Tales #7 zine. Their story Summerskin in the Bram Stoker nominated anthology Sycorax's Daughters received an honorable mention for Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year, Volume 10. Zinn contributed the nonfiction essay My Genre Makes a Monster of Me to Uncanny Magazine's Hugo Award-winning Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. Their short story, The Night Sun, and flash fiction Tea Time were published on Tor.com. Flowers for the Sea is their debut novella. Do you have any upcoming projects we should keep an eye out for, Zinn?
I am working on my second novella. Hello, first of all, hi everybody. How y'all doing? Hey, Shanghai, how you doing, girl? So I'm working on my second novella for Tor.com, and that's pretty much it right now. Working on some short stories and whatnot, but that's pretty much it. Everything's kind of secretive right now.
Yeah. Publishing. So last but not least, Dominic Dickey. Dominic Dickey is a writer, editor, cultural consultant, and Nebula Award-winning RPG hooligan. In addition to creating Trial, a narrative courtroom tabletop role-playing game about race in the criminal justice system, and co-creating Tomorrow on Revelation 3, a tabletop role-playing game about surviving and building community on a hyper-capitalist space station, Dominique has written for Thirsty Sword Lesbians, Dungeons and Dragons, and Pathfinder. Dominique works as a designer and editor at Monty Cook Games. Do you have any upcoming projects we should keep an eye out for, Dominique?
Yeah, I have a novella coming out with me on Hemlock next year. I don't have the release date yet. It's called Redundancies and Potentials, and I'm very amped about it. And my RPG Plant Girl game, which crowdfunded last summer, is now available for purchase. You can get the PDF on itch. I'm domestic-y on itch. And the print edition, which is very exciting and very pretty, will be available for purchase on Indie Press Revolution.
Nice. Thank you guys so much. And I'm going to kind of get into the questions now. So, no, I don't think I need to explain why writing about grief is so difficult and so compelling and so necessary. But what motivates you to write about grief? What draws you to writing about it? I'm gonna go, because I'm lazy, I'm just gonna go counterclockwise. So Dominique, you're up first.
Yeah, I think I'm very motivated to write about things that scare me, and I've always been very afraid of change. And I kind of conceptualize grief as a change in like your point of reference of the world. And I also think a lot about trauma as a type of grief because it's a loss of your previous conception of self. So those are the kind of questions that motivate me to write about it. And then I also think, like, as a trans person, I'm very fascinated by the ways that well-meaning people, and sometimes not well-meaning people, often look at transition as a form of death almost. The rhetoric of like, oh, if you have, gender affirming surgery, it's like a part of you is dying, or even, going as far as like trans widows. And I'm really interested in why people would respond to me becoming more myself and becoming more alive with a very complicated and misplaced sort of grief.
Sorry, do you mind explaining what trans widows are really quick?
Yeah. It's a really turfy movement of women who view themselves as straight and view their value in a heteropatriarchal society as being wives to men. And when their partners come out as trans women, they, instead of seeing that as, yes, a difficult change in your relationship and perhaps, the eventual dissolution of a relationship, see themselves as being widowed because effectively the partner that they signed up for being with and the life that they signed up for is dead, which I think is factually incorrect and very overdramatic.
Thank you for explaining. Shingar, do you care to weigh in on what motivates you to write about grief?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for explaining. That's very dramatic. I agree. I really resonated with Dominique's point about grief kind of changing your frame of reference, or death changing your frame of being a change that like is very about like what mattered before feels small as to what matters after experiencing deep grief. And I think for me, writing about grief it just happened naturally because I was experiencing a lot of grief in my life, and it made sense. Or it didn't make sense, because when you're experiencing grief, nothing makes sense, and you're just trying to survive. You're just trying to survive the like big waves and feelings. And I think it's only after I wrote about it that I realized how necessary it was to write about it and write through it. And it's been cathartic for me when I'm in seasons of grief, to just like find a way to get that out on the page. Yeah.
Zen, you care to weigh in on the question?
Absolutely. It's definitely a lot of what Dominique said in Shanghai, but it's grief literally chemically changes you. And I also like to write what scares me. I like to explore what scares me, and loss is a huge one because I've experienced a lot of loss, and I experienced loss early in my life. So I have a lot of anxiety around grief and loss. So I think it's a natural part of life that we don't talk about enough. Um, and we don't process enough. I think we all carry festering wounds of grief and loss. And it's the responsibility is on the bearer to um, work towards something like a life again. So I think writing about it, it really kind of opens up that possibility. Um, and I really hate this, and I'm so sorry, but I do have to go. I'm so sorry. This is such a great subject, and I was so excited to do it that I completely forgot about my residency at school.
Well, best of luck with residency, and thank you for the time you're able to share with us today.
Thank you for having me. This is amazing. And nice to meet you, Dominique. And Shingai, let's hang out.
Nice to meet you as well.
And I've missed you.
Thank you so much. Thank
and
you.
everyone should read Zen's book, novella, Flowers for the Sea. It's so good. Okay.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Yeah, kind of an abrupt transition. There was a way to make a segue, but my brain, I haven't had coffee. It's just not gonna happen. The synapses aren't firing like that. But
one could say it feels like a loss.
Yes. The whole panel is gonna be tinged by, this unexpected change. Tough stuff. But yeah, I don't know, I guess what everyone's respective cultures are, but at least for me in the US, it feels like grief and mourning are something that's kind of like a sign of weakness, or it's something that's private. And so I think sometimes, at least on a personal level, I feel kind of pressure to like minimize when I'm feeling it. And so I think there's something very powerful in like work where it's like that's like a huge focal point. Like you can't look away, you can't omit it from the story. Like there's something deeply wrong this character is processing how they feel about it. So I appreciate everyone's answers to what motivates them to write about grief. In terms of like inspirations, do people have any favorite like artistic works about sadness or mourning?
I have so many.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think top of the list and very basic and probably says a lot about me is WandaVision. I think the portrayal of being so unwilling to let go, even as it harms people around you, it made some points. And I can keep going or pass it to Shingai.
I mean, you can definitely keep going. I was trying to rake my brain for some answers. I feel like I do pay attention to grief in things, even though the things are not about grief necessarily. So one that comes to mind is Station 11. Just the grief scenes when the world is ending and people know that they're losing people who they love or their lives or like just Earth. I think that they were portrayed really well. There's also damn it, I can't remember the name right now, but it's this show. It's not Vikings. The Last Kingdom. Also basic, but like it says a lot about me. But then there's this scene that I like has always stayed with me, where the protagonist finds the person who killed his father, and there's this like, you haven't seen him like really cry or process emotion until that point. And then like as he is killing this man who killed his father, he is like wailing and just screaming. And it's there's something about that, like the whole perceived idea of masculinity and what it should be, and then also war, and like you said, in specific cultures, or the way that we understand specific cultures, grief is not something that's expressed loudly. And so scenes that do that always have an impact on me. Yeah, I think there's also, it's not fiction, but In the Wake, which I'm going to come back to later, by Christina Sharp, is a brilliant book on Black death and Black life and Black grief. Yeah.
I was surprised that I wasn't getting a lot of music from people. I thought it was going to be a lot of like emo, like I thought someone was going to say My Chemical Romance or something.
I forgot music.
Well, yeah, I forgot.
I made it artistic
music.
very broad, because for me, when I'm like, I want to feel sad, I'm like, when I want to cry, I'm like, let me put on like a really sad like song, like a record.
Yeah.
Or,
I do have very sad taste in music generally. Yeah. But I totally, when you floated us the question in advance, I totally did not think about music. I was thinking about books, movies, and TV shows. And that's so interesting to me. But now I'm like, wow, I totally left out like an entire like pillar of my creative psyche.
Yeah.
Wow. Funeral by Phoebe Bridgers. Lay on the floor and cry.
Absolutely. That's a good one.
I'll pipe in just because I really love this movie, but I don't know if anyone's seen the Netflix original Over the Moon, where I don't know if grief is really at the center. It's about this young Chinese girl who her father, her mother dies like at the beginning of the film very prematurely, and her father, like a year or so passes, and her father starts to move on. He's like dating and stuff like that, and the girl really doesn't know. Well, she doesn't like it. She's like, no, like if you love my mom, you wouldn't be doing this. And I don't think grief is really at the heart of the story, because it's more about like the acceptance. I think kind of like the after part, like she goes on a quest to find a moon goddess who's gonna bring her mother back from the dead. Essentially, it's been a little bit since I've seen it, so I'm probably not doing it justice, but that's kind of the general arc. And like, I think everyone watching the movie is going to be like, well, maybe most adults are going to be like, it's not going to pan out. And for me, it was like very sad, but also very cathartic, because like it reminded me the first time I realized that someone I loved was not going to be in my life anymore, ever again. Because for me, it was relatively, like it happened more when I was closer to when I was an adult. And so it felt very fresh, and it brought that up. And it was very interesting to me how like this wasn't the exact circumstance. Like the person who's no longer in my life didn't die. But how like that portrayal of grief, and like specifically it being like a child who's like, no, like good things don't end. Like I can bring this back. I can fix it. I can put this together. Like really made me think of my own situation as an adult, experiencing a very different grief, but how that felt so connected. So I just really like talking about that movie, so I just wanted to bring it up.
I have to watch it now.
It's going on my list. I also would say for movies that are really complicated about grief, I think my top two are Arrival and Inception, because I think it came out like 10 years ago, but I can't say why Arrival is about grief without really spoiling Arrival. So I'm not going to do that. But Inception is also very much about someone who has lost someone that they love and is totally unable to get past that. And like down the line, the grief manifests in ways that get in the way of their life and ability to function because it has just not been processed and has not been exercised. And Dominic Cobb needs therapy. And I always also forget how much that movie is about grief, because I will say it is an ensemble movie where all of the side characters are more interesting than the main guy, and Leo DiCaprio's character I usually forget is in Inception. Everyone else is so much cooler, but he is really going through it, and that does kind of flavor the entire plot.
That's true. And that makes me think about the other really trippy, dreamy one, where the dad-daughter, I was just talking about this with someone else recently. They're trying to colonize a different planet. Do you know what I'm talking about, Dominic?
The Pedro Pascal one with Sophie
No.
Baxter? Okay. Then no. No, I'm thinking of
The Expanse. No?
Oh, okay.
No, it's not The Expanse. That's a lie.
I was thinking of Prospect, which I've only seen once and should see again before I talk about it in any serious capacity.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so the other one that I was thinking about is this Kenyan movie called Supermodo, which makes me cry every single time that I watch it. It's a story, like, trigger warning, like it deals with cancer, and it's about this kid who has this Kenyan kid who loves superhero movies and like wants to be a superhero, and it is speculative fiction, so it's really like the twist that they pull on it is really fun. And she has cancer from the very beginning, you know that like she's probably not going to make it, and that deals with like grief that you see coming, like you know that it's coming but you're still grieving. And it doesn't take away from the intensity of it. It's a really, really great movie, one of my favorite of all time.
Thank you for sharing. I'm curious, what unique opportunities, if any, do you think the science fiction and fantasy genres provide to discuss grief?
In circle order again?
I mean, it seems like you're volunteering, so let's do circle
I
order.
don't know. Okay, sure.
You're volunteering.
Going back to my thinking about trauma as a type of grief and the sort of loss of conception of your previous self, I am also in speculative fiction, like really interested in the story after the story, and kind of where authors choose to set what like the scope of what makes it to the page. And I think if you're writing in a world where there's so much possibility for like adventure and things that are outside of the scope of like our normal everyday life, there is also a lot of room for things to go wrong. And I'm always super fascinated by what happens after the characters go on a super cool romp and save the world, et cetera, because you have probably lost someone or something you love along the way, or you have seen things that changed you or done things that changed you. So a lot of where I see room to discuss grief is in being very deliberate about where the timing of a story falls and what has happened to characters leading up to like the scope of the narrative. And like maybe you went on this massive space adventure, but now you and everyone you love is like deeply messed up about it. And I think in speculative fiction too, there's a lot of room for like series to have super large scale and play with that effectively. Like, I think the Broken Earth trilogy is a great example of that, where as the books go on, it's like, oh, these characters have been through catastrophic things, and the ongoing impact of those catastrophic things we are not going to look away from. And the books kind of start off being about loss and grief, and then they get more about loss and grief. And I think working in a genre space makes room for that kind of like playing with that.
Yeah, so much there. I think one of the things for me obviously was time travel. I think that grief has a lot to do with memory, and speculative fiction allows you to play with ideas. So with ideas like memory, and like make it a tangible thing, with time and make it a tangible thing. Yeah, so I think what I love about spec fic is that there's also so much room to sit with the grief, because it's not just moving from, like, I feel like with literary fiction, like, you can also sit with the grief, but there is moving from one logical point to the next logical point. And with speculative fiction, there's a lot more room to play around with the illogical, the things that aren't necessarily like brain oriented, and more like, how can I, take them back to a moment where they were still alive? How can I live in the memories of them? I think also about breakups as a type of ending of things, for example. And I don't know why my brain is not working properly today, and I cannot remember anything that I want to remember. But The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, that's the one. And how that movie plays with memory and as a type of grief is really interesting to me. So yeah, I just think that there's a lot more room to play with ideas in speculative fiction, in a way that lets you sit in the grief longer, which I think is important for writing grief stories.
And I feel like I do play a lot with like time and memory, and like I also think a lot about like how different technological advancements will impact bodily autonomy, and how that will lead to like more complicated ideas of understanding things that happen to you when you maybe feel those things in your body, and your body isn't entirely yours. Um, there are just so many cool things that like uh, that you have room for like outside of um, more like straight lace lit fic.
Yeah, it offers you like a different perspective, right? Like, you can enter the feelings from a different angle if you're thinking about the possibilities of what the body would become with those feelings in a spec fic way.
Thank you for sharing. That's very interesting to think about, especially like, I don't know, like grief is something you feel in the body, and if your body is like not, you have like cyborg stuff going on, or like maybe humans have evolved in this future differently. Like, how does that change how the body experiences grief? Is something that's very interesting to think about. I was curious, do you have a process for writing grief? Like, is it kind of a pulling from like personal experience, like personal feelings, or is it kind of more like a clinical, like looking at like models, like psychological models, or I'm just curious how you think through grief and translate that to writing.
My answer to this is a non-answer because I don't have a consistent process for this at all.
I think my process is mostly personal. Like, it's mostly drawn from like just the feelings. But I'm interested in the comment that Zen made right before they left, which is grief has a chemical reaction on the body and like changes how you think. Yeah, I I don't look at the models, but I want to.
I don't know how helpful they are. I know there's a one where it's like the stages where it's like, was it? I don't know them, but bargaining's in there somewhere, and there's
bargaining, denial, anger. Yeah, there's 5.
Yeah, I was just curious if there's ways that you prompt yourselves, because like I'm not a writer. I hobby write fanfic, but like something I struggle with
You
is
are
like,
a writer. That counts. Shut
okay,
up.
I'm a hobbyist. And something I struggle with is writing characters who think and react very differently from me. Because like if I were to just like stream the contest, everyone would just act like me, and that wouldn't make any sense. And so I'm kind of wondering if there's like ways that you prompt yourself to be like, okay, like how would this person handle grief that maybe if they're like not necessarily like super similar to me, how do I think through how they would handle grief, or how do I look to things in my everyday life to like understand how this person would think through grief?
I don't think that any of my characters are like, even when they're not like me, I don't think any of my characters are like entirely outside of me. Like, I think that their reactions might not be how I outwardly react in the situation, but it is still a reaction that I am capable of. So I feel like I write people who are like me rotated 90 degrees. And then, yeah, because I feel like it would be really hard for me to imagine a very like deep emotional reaction that I did not have any kind of context for. So it tends to be something where I'm like, if I were in this situation, I personally would not do this, but I could understand maybe the impulse to behave in this way.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the thought of like drawing on what we are capable of, even if it's not how we would react necessarily. I think this is such a good point because I was thinking about how grief shows up so differently for so many different people. Like, there is no one way to grieve, there is no one way to embody grief. And I think that I've seen that personally growing up because I've lost people and I've had people around me who've lost people, and there's a responding to it differently, and that's part of the weirdness of grief. I think it's the thing is, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know if like I am grieving correctly. I don't know if like I even have a right to grieve the way that I'm grieving. So there's just it's easy to write grief in the sense that you're just confused and sad. You're confused and sad and everything feels out of your control, and that's and that's the biggest part. I think then it's about like for a character who is different from me, when they are confused and sad and everything feels out of the control, what do? Like, do they binge? Do they disassociate? Do they like I will talk to my friends, but like I know people who will just like shove it all the way down and like not process it or think about it, or like they just don't have the capacity in that moment, and that's a valid reaction. Like that's survival. I think at that point, like with grief, it's what will help you survive this moment. That's how your body reacts, even if your mind is telling you maybe this is not how I should be reacting.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm really interested in this idea of like internal versus external reactions, and how like speculative fiction can take these things that are like very internal experiences and potentially make them external experiences. Like we're talking about the Broken Earth trilogy, like the ground shaking when Essen, the main character who can control earthquakes, is upset. Or even just think about like the motivating question, I guess when you're writing grief, being like, what are we capable of, is very interesting to me. I'm sorry, Shindar, you said something very good too, and I didn't write it down. It's bad. Sorry, could you like run back like the last 30 seconds? Maybe it'll jog my memory. If you don't remember either, I'll just In the replay, pretend there was a
I
nice
said something about survival.
Yes, yes. The question, grief also being like, what will help me survive in this moment? Like the right now, like this one little sliver of time. And then that branches out because you can't just do it for one sliver of time forever, I guess. So I don't really have a good wrap-up question, but those are some things that really stuck out to me as like really interesting topics for other people to think and write about and ask you questions about. Do you have a recovery process from like doing a lot of writing about emotionally heavy scenes?
My genuine, honest to God answer is that I have to go lay on the floor.
That's incredible. I'm going to steal that from you.
There's something like there's a pun in here. I'm not going for the pun. It's very grounding to just be like flat on a hard surface, and just like kind of melt. I also,
it's my favorite yoga position.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I will just like, I'll be like, wow, that was really intense. I got some good words in today. Good job. And then I flop.
That's a mood. Okay, so depending on how intense it is, like if it's intense and I'm like crying while writing it because that's happened before, I tend to just feel better anyway because crying for me is really cathartic and just makes, because I'm getting the emotions out. And if I'm in a space where I just like, I can't, like I need something else, I'll go watch cartoons in bed.
Yeah, I like vegging out with like kids cartoons. Like the Cuphead show on Netflix is like my go-to right now. I'm just like I can't think.
The what?
The Cuphead show. It's basically like SpongeBob, but with like those 20 eras like style of cartooning. I don't know. It's just I like kids cartoons because like there's only so much bad stuff that can happen because they got to keep that kids rating. And it's something I've watched before, so it's just like comforting. So.
I've been watching one called Puppy Cat.
Bee and Puppy Cat.
Bee and Puppy Cat is so sweet. I love it so much.
I've seen that, but I couldn't tell anything. I just remember the cicada who sits out the window and goes, "Can you have my babies? Can you have my babies? Can you have my babies?" Just over and over and over again. Instead of making cicada noises, and I have to just like flick it away.
It's also hella weird. It's a really weird show.
I liked Adventure Time, so that wasn't necessarily a deterrent. Do you see any importance in writing grief specifically as Black authors or reading about it specifically as Black readers?
Am I going first again? Okay.
We could do Nina make Shingai go first.
Do you want to?
I don't care either way. Whatever you prefer. Do you have an answer? You sounded like you had an answer.
Because I kind of do.
Amazing.
I think there's like a really important empathy component in seeing an emotional experience in fiction and realizing that you have had or are capable of a similar emotional experience. And I think a lot of, like, with my background is specifically like Black American, but I think like within that context, a lot of Black people aren't like allowed or encouraged to make space for negative emotions, especially if those emotions are like big and irrational and might look like anger or look destructive or look selfish, even, which is really harmful in the long run, because I do think that you have to like feel those things in your body to get out of them and not just like have that sitting on you for the rest of your life. So I think that it can be really important to like show people that it's okay and normal to have these like really big emotional experiences, and that it's okay to acknowledge those feelings and that you can eventually get past them.
Yeah. So much of that is so much of what I want to say.
You should have gone first.
No, that was brilliant. It was brilliantly articulated. The way that I've been thinking about it is in a society that is predetermined by largely whiteness and capitalism. There is no space and time for grief, because it is not productive, because it doesn't produce any tangible outcome, and it takes away from labor, and and it yeah, in that system there's no space for you to be a whole person, and grief is asking you to be like the hardest parts of a whole person. um, and I think when it comes to Black people, especially across the world, like I think that Black death is normalized a lot more than white death is. And so there is a sense of being desensitized to Black death. And kind of speaking to what Dominique just said, an encouragement to just move on. Like our lives are replaceable, which is deeply fucked up. And us grieving ourselves is big resistance to that. And it's saying that no, I will take the time, I will take the energy, however long it takes me, to grieve Black life that is lost, whether that's generational, ancestral, immediate, or even smaller griefs that look different than death. That still is something that we are doing intentionally that the dominant system does not want us to do. So I'm a big advocate for writing about Black grief, because I think it's so necessary, because like Dominique said, we haven't been given permission. And that's where I bring back In the Wake by Christina Sharp, because she talks about this in detail and also talks about the afterlives of slavery, which is a really interesting topic. Just thinking about like the trauma that is carried on even from the loss that we may not have direct access to.
Yeah, I think a recurring topic in this discussion has been that like grief is something that has to be felt. Like either you're writing it out or you're talking about it, or there's something you have to do to like let it go, or it just kind of festers. And I guess I was wondering in terms of like what you're seeing about grief now. I'm curious because like from the writer's side, you kind of get like a sneak peek because like all the NDA stuff that I can't ask about, you see, and you can't really share. There's some other upcoming writers, but um, I guess where do you see the conversations about Black grief going in sci-fi and fantasy in the future? Or are there any like up and coming authors you want to shout out where you're like, maybe you haven't heard of them, but like you need to read them. Like they're doing like really good stuff around grief. Sorry, that was like a big question to kind of like not give in the intro packet, but I just thought of it.
It is a really good question. I feel like I need to like marinate for a second. I feel like what I want in this regard is also like a very similar answer to like other similar questions about like where do you see this genre space going or this art form going. And my answer is always that I want like more room for Black people and queer people and trans people, because the more of us there are in a given space, the less pressure there is on one person or one work to be like the thing. I went to a panel at Worldcon in, I want to say 2018, when the Own Voices hashtag had like just taken off. And there was this thing that came up that felt really impactful to me. That was the idea of like Own Voices actually puts a lot of pressure on people to represent an entire identity. And that can like get in the way of making work that is like messy in the sense that it is about people being messy, but also messy in the sense of like bad, because not everything you make is going to be a hit. And there, like someone said, like in on the panel, I don't remember who it was, that was like, we have hashtag Own Voices, but the goal is for the prevalence of marginalized people in the space, like to reach such a critical mass that we can have a branching off hashtag that's like Own Voices trash and celebrate like all of the bad stuff too, and let people have enough work that not all of it has to be like the best thing. I think I just want to get to that point. I want to get to a point where no like one person or one person's work is expected to really like carry a discussion if it doesn't want to or doesn't have to.
Yeah, I think following on that point, I just thought that like actually Black writers have been writing about grief forever. And we write about other things too. Like I think the thing about existing with the history of Blackness is that there is always a juxtaposition of feeling. There is always like an insistence on joy amidst all the grief. But the grief also has to take up airtime. And I love that we're able to have this conversation right now because it's important to bring it out and bring it up. But I also don't think that there needs to be a genre like grief speculative fiction specifically, because I think yeah, like I want us to be able to carry all the things together, to carry the joy and the grief and everything in between. And I do think of writers who have been doing that, like Octavia Butler, N.K. Jemisin, like we just brought up in the Broken Earth trilogy, Akwaeke Medzi, who's one of my faves recently, Yvette Lisa Adore, Yvette Lisa, who is my Voodoo Knots co-founder, has a whole collection on Black women's bodies and death, and that's a really good one. And yeah, there's The Old Drift by Namwali Serpel, which is also one that I love. Yeah, I just think there's so much on grief in so many different books by Black writers, and hopefully we can carry all the things.
Yeah, because when I was thinking of, I guess, the panel and structuring it and stuff, I was like, I don't know if there's really any trends that I see in grief, because I feel like it's just so ingrained in life. Like, how can you write a story and it not touch on grief in some way, if that makes sense? Like, there would be really obvious ones, like, I guess if we're talking about Black authors specifically, like discussing the transatlantic slave trade and things like that, or if we're talking about middle grade, it is very common to have like a parent die. But yeah, it was kind of one of those things where it was like, really, I could have looked at almost any book, I think, and found some way that grief plays a role in it, which was interesting. But yeah, I didn't know if I could be like, oh, like this, there's like the top 5 like things people are grieving in the Black SFF. Like, I don't know if I could have done that even if I was really trying to.
It's pretty cool. I think it shows our range. Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Dominique, I would love you to speak more to what you mentioned earlier about being trans and death being associated with transitioning. and just what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I actually had a story out last year that deals really heavily with this. It's called Drowned Best Friend, and it was in fantasy. Um, and I think the real like crux of it for me is there are like things that I've had said to me about my transition, or things that I've, people have said to my friends about their experiences. And then, the whole trans widow thing. So it's not like an isolated incident, even if it's a way of thinking that arises organically from like multiple people. It is kind of like a broad based and unfortunately quite common response to someone like coming out or medically transitioning. That, if you are removing or modifying parts of your body, then it is like a part of you has died. When I don't see anyone having funerals for the millions of red blood cells that I lose every day, but that's fine. Or if you like change your name and change your appearance, and it people kind of fall into acting like you're a different person and then grieving the person that you were, which I do think is not inherently an incorrect response. I think there is I think it is perfectly acceptable to grieve change in someone you love in any capacity, whether it's like gender or just someone like moving away or growing up or getting a new haircut. You can own that something that you were attached to about this individual has changed and that affects you. I think where it becomes a problem is people, especially parents and spouses, trying to process that with or at the trans person in their life, and making that emotional response the responsibility of the trans person. I think that's where it becomes really harmful and really messed up, and honestly, like really dramatic, especially when people are like, "Oh, my spouse is trans," and it's like they died. Which, no, it is not. There are, people who are actually dying, and that is not what is happening to you, factually. And I think I have been very afraid of people seeing the ways that I've changed as a loss and not as an absolute win, because I am the most me that I've been, and I am the happiest that I've been. And I think that's true for a lot of people who take steps to transition, especially if those steps ultimately end up being right for them. And when people express this kind of deep grief for who I used to be, what it really says to me is that they miss a version of me that was not authentic, and would rather that I show up and pretend for their own comfort than be the person that I need myself to be. And again, that's a pretty messed up emotional response to put on the trans person in your life.
Kind of a tangent, but this discussion is making me think of Sunskins by Darcy Denfololo. It's a piece of flash fiction from Baffling Magazine. It's a more on like the weaponized grief perspective. It's a horror short about a group of gay Nigerian men whose mothers like invade their dreams and find out that they're gay, and it's from the mother's perspective, and it's about their reaction. And it was like a terrifying read for me. And yeah, it's more of a horror short because of what the reaction is. But I think there's something similar in terms of the grief discussion about like catharsis and stuff. And also, this is kind of was trying not to jack Susan Palumbo's questions. This is a question Susan's been circling on Twitter, and so I was like, I'll leave this to them. But like, a question they've been asking is like, when does the grief take it from sci-fi, fantasy, non-horror into the horror realm? Which like this discussion was really making me think back to the short.
That is fascinating, and honestly, I think that the lines are already so wibbly that I do think that it is worth pursuing an answer, and I do like big up to people who come up with how they want to answer that question for themselves. But I almost wonder if, for me, just being aware of the question might be more important than actually moving towards a unified answer.
I agree with that. I feel like even thinking about grief itself is horrific. So the line is very thin. I remember my novella and story being nominated in horror horror awards, and I was like, I wasn't writing horror in my mind, but that's how it came across because of how dark it gets when you're thinking about death in an honest way. And humans are terrified of what they do not know or cannot understand, and death is something that we can't fully understand. The other thing that both your comments made me think of is grief is also about, it's not just about like what has been lost in the past. It's also the loss of a future with someone or something, whatever it is you're grieving. There is a future that you had seen or imagined. I was thinking about this, like when I came out to my parents and to people in my life, and I know that their reaction to some degree came from a place of fear, and a place of loss of the future that they imagined for me. And yeah, it's interesting because you're saying that I haven't died. I've just become more myself. Like, that's something that should be celebrated. Yeah.
And like, I do think that it is perfectly fair if, for example, like my mother or grandmother is deeply mourning the idea of me in a wedding dress or whatever someday. But I don't think I think it's where it becomes unfair is processing that response with or at me, especially because my answer is, would you rather see me in a dress or alive?
Yeah.
I just want to have a little silence, I guess, to let that sit. I feel like it's a very powerful question. I feel like now that you brought up weaponized grief, that could be like a whole other discussion, but I want to respect people's time. I said it was an hour, so. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming out. Thank you to the viewers for tuning in. I think I'm having issues posting the works people were discussing. I tried to put them up in the comments, and StreamYard's giving me red signals, so I will put them up after the live. And if there's any comments I missed from viewers, I apologize. If you said nice things to authors, I will be sure to pass them on email. Thank you again, everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Any last words from you both before we wrap up?
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is incredible. Dominique, it was so nice to be on this panel with you.
It's lovely to meet you as well.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I will say one more thing. My friend keeps saying how we don't have enough grief literacy. And I had never termed it that, but I really like that way of thinking about it, like grief literacy, which is ways of showing us that we're not alone when we are grieving, which is what literature can do.
Thank you for sharing that. Take care, everybody. Goodbye and have a good one.
Bye, y'all.